So Maida, I'm gonna go ahead and let everybody in because we're at like 9:02. So let me, one moment. Let me just,
Okay.
I'm gonna admit all and then we can start. Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Good morning, good morning, welcome.
Good morning.
Great to have you. We're at day 3. We're in for a treat today. We have some really great presentations. Yeah, I don't know if Alberto, you wanted to go ahead and
I will
get it started.
Sir Medardo. Thank you, Jillian.
Thank you.
So good morning, everyone. The first speaker is going to be Dr. Medardo Rosario. Dr. Medardo Rosario is an assistant professor in the Department of Modern Languages at Florida International University. He obtained a Bachelor of Sciences with a concentration in chemistry from the University of Puerto Rico, and a Master of Arts with a concentration in Hispanic Studies, also from the University of Puerto Rico, and a doctorate in Hispanic and Portuguese Brazilian Studies from the University of Chicago. His academic research revolves around 2 themes: the influence of Spanish Golden Age literature in Latin America and representations of the Caribbean in cartography and literature developed in Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries. So welcome, Medardo, and please go ahead.
Thank you, Alberto. Thank you for the invitation. It's been great to be part of this program. I feel I've learned so much, and I really liked the dynamic of having a conversation where people bring their input and impressions. Like you said, one of my research lines is devoted to the study of representations of the Caribbean, both in literature and cartography of the 16th and 17th century. And what I found really interesting about being part of this project is that not only at FIU, we are developing a digital repository for this type of primary sources that allowed us to trace the representations of the Caribbean really early on, but also we're adapting these materials to provide them for to students in Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and Miami. So constantly we are in this back and forth trying to connect what we are finding in the archive and bringing it back to the present to make it meaningful. And having this opportunity to think about racial dynamics of Puerto Rico, contemporary Puerto Rico, it's another great opportunity to do that. I'm gonna start sharing my screen. Please let me know if you are able to see it. Okay, perfect. Can you guys?
Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah,
we can see it. Thank you.
I think when we talk about racial dynamics in Puerto Rico, usually we think, or at least in Puerto Rico, I'm talking about my experience, this notion of a mixture of 3 races: Spanish, African, and indigenous. And more often than not, every time a conversation about race emerges, any claim about racism gets to be dismissed because everyone in one way or another can claim that they, in one way or another, have a relative that is Black, or they themselves are mixed individuals. So the purpose of this presentation is not to explore whether or not the Black community in Puerto Rico suffer inequalities. I'm taking that for granted. But to explore what are the mechanisms that allow that what I call myth of the three races allows to develop certain narratives that silence those voices, and to provide examples of artists, writers, important figures in the political arena during the 20th century, mostly, that allows for the Black community to reinsert themselves in the narrative of a national identity. And what's interesting, and echoing what Dr. Duani mentioned the first day of our series, and I borrowed one of his images, is that if you look at the census of 2000, 75%, 76% of Puerto Ricans declared themselves as white, and in the census of 2010, 80% of Puerto Ricans classify themselves as white. If you consider that's higher than the amount of populations of whites in the U.S. So when you hear that statistic, it's at best preposterous to think that a population of a clearly mixed people from the three races that we are from the get-go told that we're constituted select the white race. And that these many critics, for example, like Yalimar Bonilla from Hunter College, have studied the dynamics of race in Puerto Rico, and she points out something very interesting, that in Puerto Rico, seldomly we talk about race in the way that it's discussed in the US. And more than that, not only we don't talk about the race as we talk in the US, but when we talk about race, we talk about race almost going around the subject with epithets, or it has to do more with behaviors. So to say that in Puerto Rico we don't talk about race, it would be incorrect, but the way that we talk about race is different. And part of this presentation is an invitation to start, in a way, creating concepts, the vocabulary necessary to properly describe the racial dynamics in Puerto Rico. And so basically in the census, you get this question in the US Census. The question number 5 is really easy to answer. You answer Puerto Rican. But then when you have to select the answer for the question number 6, things get more complicated, because people seem not to have the vocabulary. And what Bonilla found out when she started asking people directly what they thought was the race, she often faced silence first, and then like a search of different categories to avoid to classify oneself as Black. And I think going back to Professor Duani, when he presented us all the different concepts that are used to talk about race in Puerto Rico, I think this is very interesting, because instead of looking at these terms solely as negative terms, it would be interesting to see the possibility of reappropriating certain terms, as the Black community has used in the US, to claim local or national paradigm of race. And it's interesting because when we think about this apprehension about talking about race, and we go back to the graph, we see a big gap between 1935 and 2000 that corresponds to the government of Luis Muñoz Marin in the first place, who got to be governor in 1948. And Luis Muñoz Marin himself thought that one of the characteristics that define Puerto Rico and allow Puerto Rico to be envisioned as a place open for commerce, it was like the racial utopia. He thought that because we are, quote unquote, all mixed, there were no racial problems as the one as the U.S. So what happened was that when he started being governor, the census, the federal census, gave him the opportunity to perform his own census, el censo criollo. And from all those decades, the question about race was completely removed. So this is important to point out, because the apprehension to talk about the so-called apprehension about talking about race is not something that is intrinsic to the Puerto Rican, but it's something really by design. It's not till 2000 and the census of 2000, where after a government that followed the pro-statehood ideology wanted to be closer to the US, we were faced for the first time with said questions. And there's even videos and audios of Luis Muñoz Marin talking about this utopia, racial. And it's interesting because the government of Luis Muñoz Marin, that with him, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, or Estado Libre Asociado de Puerto Rico, emerged, ignited the institutionalization of the island. So something like the Institute of Culture in Puerto Rico was founded during those first decades. And here we have a symbol that we saw earlier also. And this is very interesting because we have here, in a pictorial sense, the presentation of this idea of the myth of the three races. If you see, it's interesting to see that the three of them are men. Of course, the Spaniard, it's in the middle. He is carrying the written letter, the Grammar of Nebrija, published in 1492. Next to him is the Taíno. The Taíno is carrying a semi, and also is carrying yuca. It has corn, tobacco, plants around him. And then you have the African figure that carries a machete and a drum. Next to his legs, there is a mask, a Vejigante mask, as a representation of the contribution of the culture. Interestingly, the Vejigantes masks are used in Carnival and are used usually in games celebrations. No, like it seems that the cultural manifestations of the African are mediated through the Spanish length. And then you have on the side, according to the Instituto de Cultura, plantain plant, but what it looks more like a cane. plant. So we see here what it seems to be equiparation of all the figures, but we know, and it's evident, that the center and the tension of this emblem, it's without a doubt the Spanish figure. And this is very interesting, because when we get the discovery of Puerto Rico in 1493, we are, when we move to the peninsula, as we know, is experiencing a lot of turmoil among itself. It's in a year before, it has expelled the Jewish community, and it's really managed the situation with the Moors in ways that will have extreme consequences, and that will develop through the whole 16th and 17th century. So this idea of the Spaniard as a pure race, as someone that is purely culturally pure, Catholic, without stain, it's something that it's simply not the case. And in that sense, that allowed us to see how there's a simplification of the figure of the Spaniard, of something monolithic, when in fact we know that the subjects that arrived to America are experiencing a profound national identity. What's interesting also, starting to problematize the figure of the Spaniard, and to break away from this idea of purity, is that through the lens of the Spaniard, we get sadly the first representations Europe does from Native Americans. And when we see, for example, Columbus' journal, he describes the indigenous people in this first encounter, and it's very interesting to see how he focuses on the phenotype of the indigenous people. For example, he points out that their skin is not white, also is not black, points that they're very young. He points out that they are not carrying weapons. So he is offering almost an express, a description of these individuals as people that potentially can be exploited. They are young, they are submissive, and they are in a way very similar to Canarians. So we know how to deal with these so-called people. So this is the introduction of indigenous people through the Spaniards. It's very interesting, because the narrative that is created in Puerto Rico is that the Taínos were good and not problematic, vis-a-vis the Caribbeans that were violent and were the ones that rebelled. What we know, that's not the case. But something that is also very interesting about the Taino substrate is that when we think about the influence, for a long time we thought that because they were annihilated, murdered really early on, there was not a concrete influence racially in the DNA of the Puerto Rican. And I think last decade there was a study performed at the University of Puerto Rico, and they, from the sample that they study, almost 60% of the population have have mitochondrial DNA, meaning that the DNA in the mitochondria of the cell that it's passed through the mother side, in many cases for Puerto Ricans, comes from an indigenous subject. So whether or not this information changes our perception of our biological configuration, what's interesting in this case is like how this is used, how the scientific discourse is used to enforce the idea of a mixed community. Moreover, it seems that the idea of having an indigenous origin allows for Puerto Ricans to locate themselves in time before the arrival of the Spanish people and before the arrival of the Africans. So in that sense, there's always, often I've heard or I've read this claim, yes, we could be Black, but we're different. Yes, we could be considered white, but we're different. There's a certain element of difference that if one thinks that what implies that what is the contribution of the insertion of the indigenous people in this type of myth. And something so essential as the name Boriquen, which is the so-called name for the island used by the indigenous people. I'm saying so-called because there's so many variants, and we have the registers of what Spanish people understood was really the name. But from Boriquen comes the adjective Boricua. And that's basically the way in which specifically the diaspora performs its Puerto Rican essence, right? There's something that connects that. Also interesting, and now passing towards the African component of this triad, how the indigenous component is used as a buffer to, in a way, dilute Blackness in Puerto Rico. If the texture of your hair, and this is something that we have talked extensively here, it's straighter, you could be considered Indio, something that we know in Latin America, in places like Peru or Mexico, it's a derogatory term. And then we have the Black component of these three races. Already in 1513, there was a ship full of slaves in Puerto Rico. We can consider the history of Puerto Rico in terms of the quantity of slaves in the island. We can say that at the end of the 16th century, we can say that around 15,000 slaves inhabited the island. That quantity fluctuated dramatically till the year 1815, where Puerto Rico gets la cédula de gracia. La cédula de gracia, it was a decree that opened Puerto Rico for, open the ports, open Puerto Rico for foreign investment. And with that, flux of slaves came to the island. Of course, I'm really simplifying the complexities of all the situation, but those 3 decades during the 19th century, from 1815 to 1840, is an increment of the number of Africans in the island. At its peak, I think it was 40,000. And at the moment of emancipation in 1873, the number of slaves enslaved people in Puerto Rico was around 30,000 people. A population that has a solid footprint in our culture. And more than anything, this is seen in music, like in other parts of the Caribbean, and bomba, reggaeton, salsa. The beat of the drum seems to be something that not only it's ubiquitous of every single musical production that leaves the island, but also a way in which many of our authors have think and had get inspired. So the music and the lyrics of many of these manifestations have then been passed and have been a way for the Black community to insert themselves in the narrative that often leave them behind. And now I want to talk about Black authors in Puerto Rico, or white authors that write around the Black subject. Again, I'm not gonna be extensive, but before doing that, I would like for a moment to approach methodology applied by Michael Cook. He was a Jamaican professor working at Yale during the 80s. And he formulated 4 phases for the development of African-American literature. The first one was self-veiling, that is to say, authors would imitate white writers, and they would hide under that performance. The second example, it's he calls the face of solitude. We can include here slave narratives, and a figure like Frederick Douglass is very representative of this. The third phase that he identifies is kinship, that is to say that Black authors start creating communities. And the literature, it's employed to create a notion of prideness and racial identity. Movements like the Harlem Renaissance in New York, it's an example of that. And then the fourth one, intimacy. This is very interesting because for Cook, that's the goal every African-American author should have. And that is to say that you already are not trying to write about your race or your identity. You basically write about whatever you want, and you have the liberty to be more than the labels that the market or the society is imposing on you. And I think this is very interesting. It would be naive to simply apply the system to the Puerto Rican model, but what attracts me about Cook's work first is that someone from the Caribbean thinking about representations of Blackness, but also how we in Puerto Rico and the Caribbean can also start identifying connectors that allowed us to describe our literature in more effective ways that are not exhaustive, but allowed us to have a better comprehension. And this is very important in a country that, like I said, seldomly race is considered. Something like this seems to be important. And the first figure that I want to mention is Luis Pales Matos. He wrote he has an extensive works of works of literature, but he in 1917 wrote Tuntún de Pasa y Grifería, and he is the initiator of this movement that really elevated the Black culture in Puerto Rico. This is a classic of Puerto Rican literature, and of course he had a lot of criticism because one could argue that he's appropriating from Black culture to create all these poems. So it would be very interesting to see how Pales Matos survives all the debates that we are having right now. So in a way, the same way I would say the same way Edward Said was obsessed with representations of people from the Middle East done by Europe. It would be very interesting is something parallel, the study of what's the representation of Blackness through Luis Pales Matos. He considering himself a white man in the Puerto Rican thing. So thinking about how to organize that, so it seems that there's this phase or phenomena, literary phenomena, where authors that do not self-identify as Black appropriate from the culture, right, and consider the culture as their own. And making a big jump. Right now, it's very nice to see that we have a lot of voices, a lot of Black voices, and voices that identify themselves as Black. Probably many of you have know the work of Mayra Santos Febres, Yolanda Arroyo Pizarro, César Cardona. And what's interesting about these authors is the notion, they are aware of the notion of intersectionality and constantly fighting to be boxed in one category. For example, Yolanda Arroyo Pizarro works a lot with queerness. And her short stories and writing explore what are the notions of what means to be not only a Black woman, but a woman, masculine woman and feminine woman. And in a way, she's always pushing the boundaries. She's also a very interesting figure because she's very connected to certain networks of schools in Puerto Rico, and she does almost an activist work to provide information for children about Blackness. Mayra Santos Febres, one of our most important authors. What's interesting about Mayra Santos Febres, and it's something that it's evident. I can attest to that because in one of her classes, one of the things that the discussions that we often had in a class of literary criticism of Latin America was to question the notion of national literatures. That is to say, what means to be a Puerto Rican author? What means to be a Mexican author? What it means to be a Black author? In regards to what are the topics that people expect from me to write as such. So because of that, she's always not only through her novels, but through her cultural work, creating spaces where those categories of what it means to be a Puerto Rican author, but also what it means to be a Black woman author means. And the case of César Cardona is also very interesting. He has a column in the Nuevo Dia, in the national newspaper, how he, as Black man positions himself and starts looking at the daily life and the daily news of our island. And in a way, it's very interesting to see specifically in his last book, Levitain Mon Amour, how there's certain notion of domesticity, like attention to the domestic objects and materiality, and that his experience as a Black man, it's not necessarily what it's at the forefront, but percolates, because that's basically what he is. So interesting that the connecting factor is that all of them are well positioned politically, and are voices that are not only talking about Blackness, but also about the colonial situation of Puerto Rico. And that's something that, especially in the last summer, seemed to have increased significantly in the island, where a lot of our artistic community came out during the pandemic and self-identified as Blacks or Afrodescendientes, and started having discussions of what it means and how their phenotype affects the type of roles or the type of impact they can have in the media. And this is like very important to highlight this political component, because from the moment that we were invaded by the US in 1989, Puerto Rico has always had Black political leaders that have been in the forefront of certain movements. And one of them is Pedro Albizu Campos, a leader for during the first half of the 20th century of the pro-independence movement. Brilliant man that was able to accomplish things that no one thought someone, a Black man, would accomplish coming from Puerto Rico. He attended Harvard. There he met leaders from the Indian independent movement, from the Irish movement, and what's interesting is that he decides to go back to Puerto Rico and to start fighting for what he thought was the correct thing to do. And this political thing, it's still alive. And one example is, for example, el colectivo Étnica or Revista Étnica. It's a magazine, but it's more than that. Is a group of activists that are advocating for the visibility of Black communities. For example, to the right, you have a T-shirt of a campaign that they run, that they were asking Puerto Ricans to classify themselves as Black people in the last census. And I do think the figure of Albizu, how the protests last summer affected or ignited a conversation in Puerto Rico about race, only underlines something that we know, and it's clear, is that there's a conversation between the Puerto Ricans in the island and the Puerto Ricans in the US. Something that it's very important, and I think like I do think it's important not to impose to the island certain paradigms of race that do not necessarily describe our reality. It would be naive to isolate the island completely and not allow how those new perspectives help us to see ourselves. So the diaspora of Puerto Rico in the US, it's incredible, right? Especially in Florida, where we have the University of Miami, there's almost a million, more than a million Puerto Ricans. Places like New York and Chicago have been places that have concentrated this dialogue. And I think I don't have to insist about this. We have in our university Professor Duani, who is one of the big figures in all these discussions. But I think it's the diaspora in Puerto Rico, especially for us as teachers, provide us the opportunity to make relevant and to connect certain realities that we live here in the US to Puerto Rico, understanding that there's always a flux, and that flux not only brings people, but also brings ideas and new ways to see from both parts, to see the world. And when we talk about Latinidad, Latinx, and what it means to be Puerto Rican, sadly, in the 20th century, the representations that we've had have been are being controlled by media. We have something like West Side Story, and the case of West Side Story is very interesting because you have Rita Moreno that speaks English with an American accent, that have to pretend to be Puerto Rican by performing an accent. Most of the actors were their skin were darkened. So there's a double problematic there. It's like I'm not gonna hire a Black person to play a role, and on top of that person needs to be darkened in order to offer correct representation. And something like the newly released In the Heights, that of course this is the Dominican Republic represented in national in Washington Heights, but it is a good example because Lin-Manuel Miranda, Puerto Rican, writes this play, and all of the sudden, after the big success the play had 10 years ago, everyone is giving him a hard time because of the lack of a representation of Black Latinos. And when you think about the way Puerto Ricans have been conditioned to think about race, it seems very interesting that for Lin-Manuel, one wonders if he's a victim of that, like of that myth of the three races. Like I don't see race because all of us are mixed, but everyone knows that not everyone circulates society in the same way. And this is why this is very very interesting. Another figure that I find fascinating that allows me to connect Puerto Rico with the is the figure of Arturo Alfonso Schomburg. He's a Puerto Rican that moved to the US and basically developed the biggest collection of Black art in the world, and gave the origin of the New York Library collection of Black artifacts and culture. And the fact that he comes from the Caribbean, he has that perspective. It's someone that's having the linguistic experience. Seems not only significant and important how a Puerto Rican, a person from the Caribbean, had the opportunity to curate and organize how, in many ways, how the Black community in the US starts seeing itself in a way that matters. The same, I only have two slides more. The same example a similar example is the relationship between the Black Panthers and Young Lords, how these groups emerged to fight police brutality, to provide basic services as lunches, daycare to the communities that they live, because they were completely disenfranchised from the government support. And it's very interesting how the Young Lords get inspired in the 70s by the Black Panthers. And in certain moments in Chicago, they even have activities together. And there's this shared history that seldom is underlined, that allows to make connections between the two communities as something that, yes, it's important and necessary to identify and celebrate the differences, but there's so many things in common. And the last example that I want to bring is happened last year. It's the conversation that Ta-Nehisi Coates had with AOC during the Martin Luther King Day. It's a conversation of 45 minutes, but it's very interesting to see around minute 23 when Ta-Nehisi starts asking about Hurricane Maria, and how she starts explaining the colonial condition of the Puerto Rican, and how that makes us in the US citizens, second-class citizens. And that there was a moment of recognition where Ta-Nehisi was able to connect and see himself, recognize himself in that type of prejudice that seemed like a moment of communion, and indicates that there's still important figures that are trying to bring together these two communities. To close, I think it's important to recognize as a Puerto Rican that grew up in the island, that this idea of the three cultures contributing and considered as the same often allows for the silencing of the experience of Black people in the island. And one way to fight that is to, in the classroom, is to bring examples of authors of literally are writing themselves into the narrative, and to especially considering us as people working in the US, showing examples of how the racial paradigm in the US help us to understand the paradigm of Puerto Rico, not to enforce it, not to apply it indistinctively, but to further create a paradigm of our own. So thank you very much. That's all.
Thank you, Medardo. Amazing. Well, I think that again, we have like 10 minutes that were initially destined for a recess, for a break, but well, that initiative failed tremendously. So I think that we can use it to discuss a little bit what we just heard. So any questions?
Sorry, Alberto, I was going to add also, I think Asielo is going next. So if So in the meantime, while people are asking questions, if you want to test any technology that you have, we can do that at the same time, simultaneously.
I completely trust on Asiel proficiency in these matters. So he's going to be fine.
Can I ask a question to test the technology?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'm gonna go ahead and try to adjust my lights because
Okay.
it's a little bit dark. I think it's a little bit better here.
That looks good.
All right, so I had a question because this subject is one that has been with us for so many years in the Caribbean, particularly the Spanish speaking Caribbean, right? In Cuba and the Dominican Republic, this idea that we sort of have progressed down this issue to the point that we don't care about race anymore, right? This sort of myth, right? This is to some extent happening in Brazil, although Brazil is activists in Brazil are very much
on top of it.
Yeah, they're very much in the midst of this discussion. But to me, there's always been something missing because, particularly in the discussion in Brazil, it seems that the U.S. and the way that we understand race in the U.S. is this idea of self-identifying and so forth, has a stronghold on how we apply this issue or talk about this issue elsewhere. And you mentioned in your talk that it's not necessarily a solution to uplift this narrative or the way that we even understand race in the U.S. and put it or juxtapose it or transport it to the island, right? Because the island has a different reality, Brazil has a different reality, Cuba has a different reality. So what is, I guess the question is, what is the other way? If the U.S., if the ignoring the problem of race as we do in many parts of the Caribbean, it's also neglecting the very racism that exists. But then the model of the U.S. isn't necessarily the right model. What is happening in between those two?
I think from the beginning, it's accepting that tackling this problem, it's an asymptotic problem. It's like you will never find a perfect solution to describe a complex problem like that. Because the moment you start creating categories, the moment you start describing a phenomena, inadvertently, you start excluding because you have to group. So I think the solution that I feel it's the most convenient first has to be first let the communities speak, create spaces where they can talk about the realities that they are experiencing, and starting from that, I think at the moment that you have your ear in the ground, you are able to at least attempt to create a model, a racial model that, first of all, in the case of Puerto Rico, starts recognizing the existence of inequalities and differences among different groups, but also a model that it's not categorizing or organizing the racial milieu from the top down or from other communities that have access to certain information that don't necessarily represent what's happening. So yeah, those are my solutions, but I know that they're insufficient because if I would have the answer, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's more.
And I think James has a question.
Thank you very much. I actually have a few questions, but I'll go at it one by one. So thank you, Medardo or Dr. Rosario, whichever you wish. Number one, you mentioned the seal of the Instituto de Cultura and the three representations of the Taíno, the Español, and then the Africano, or the Afrodescendiente. As it exemplifies the three races. Could you develop a little bit more? Were there other images that were similar to that seal that have been circulating in Puerto Rico? What sort of materials are used the three races myth beyond that seal, or is it just in that particular pictorial context?
Should I answer? Or
No, we can go back and forth. We can,
okay, yeah.
whichever you wish.
I mean, it would be nice to have the material. It's an excellent question. The material available to show you. Yes, you know where this Omar, the person that this engraving. It's a very popular and well-regarded, was a very important, well-regarded artist. But somewhere that this type of configuration appears over and over and over is on the imagery that you can find in local festivals. In Puerto Rico, there's a festival for everything. A festival for the plata and a festival for everything. So part of the configuration of those festivals, you would have the music, and also you would have kiosks of crafts, artesanías. And this idea of the three faces appearing in stones, in a cloth painted by hand, it's something very recurrent when you go through all these. So there's a systematic application of this notion. And for example, the emblem was envisioned by Ricardo Alegría, which is an important anthropologist in Puerto Rico that basically configured or articulated the cultural program during the 20th century, or part of it. It's a very influential figure. But I think that reflected itself in I think in that type of representation. So that's what I can say for the moment. Yeah, but I will gladly send you like a more representation.
Oh, sure.
No, because I think you and I that have worked with expresses a lot. This type, the way that figures are placed, it's an amazing resource for
absolutely.
talk about race for students, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then
I'm afraid that we're gonna need to leave it here, even when it's fascinating. I do have some other questions that I am gonna need to make Medardos in the future, because we don't have time. I'm sorry. So it's 10 already. In order to maintain the schedule, I'm gonna need to introduce Asiel, and later we're gonna continue with Corina. So it's a pleasure for me to introduce my dear friend and colleague Asiel Sepúlveda. Dr. Asiel Sepúlveda is assistant professor of art history at Simmons University. His academic work on lithography and public life in colonial Cuba has received numerous awards and recognitions, including fellowship support from the Cuban Heritage Collection, the John Carter Brown Library, and the American Antiquarian Society. His latest research consists of a book-length project titled Havana Impressions, Print Culture and Global Modernity in Plantation Cuba. This study reveals how the plantation system shaped global imaginaries of the Caribbean city, some of which are being recycled by the tourism economy. So thank you, Asiel, for being here with us.
All right. Can you hear me okay? Yes. I'm going to share my screen. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. And I'm very excited to be here with you today. Very excited to be back at FIU, even if it is through this digital medium. I remember vividly falling in love with art history as an undergraduate at FIU. And now, so many years later, we're still doing that work. So it's a little bit of a nostalgia to speak today here. But I want to reflect a little bit on the business of city building in the Caribbean and the role that the visual arts play in such a process. And I'm particularly interested in, let's see if I can, here we go. I'm particularly interested in Eusebio Leal's project to restore Havana's historic district, also known that the sort of city core known as Old Havana or La Habana Vieja. As some of you might know, Eusebio Leal, who's passed away recently, was a historian and international figure, really, that spearheaded an extensive renovation campaign that revitalized Havana's colonial city during the 1990s, and that project extends onto the present day. So I want to, in this brief presentation, I want to flesh out some of the early beginnings of this restoration and how images of the 19th century and images of a slave society are sort of creeping in back into the city via the restoration of many of these colonial plazas. All right, the business of restoration is one that deals greatly in images and imaginaries. It seeks to bring back buildings and spaces from the dead by mobilizing old images, paintings, prints, architectural drawings, etc. It must also produce a new image out of the old ones. That is, it must present the projects to the world to see as an image. That is really important in tourism economies like that of Cuba, where pictures are used to attract visitors, right? So the image is always in play in the making of the city. Now, the challenge of restoring a city like Havana is that its image has been in a political tug of war between the Cuban exile and the island's socialist government. I'm sure some of you have seen some of these photographs on social media. They're ubiquitous, and they are meant to stage a comparison before and after socialism, right? So here we have a Facebook post, for example, that I pulled, where Havana's deteriorated environment of today, sort of juxtaposed against these sort of clean urban spaces of black and white photographs of urban spaces in the early to the mid 20th century. Now, such pictures and such comparisons highlight the decay of communism and its harsh material realities. On the other hand, the Cuban government and the Office of the City Historian have been very successful in propagating an image of classic American cars in front of colorful buildings. So this is sort of the stock image that we see of Havana, and sort of when we think of Cuba internationally, this is one of those images that is circulates on the internet. But beyond this political strife, there is another set of problematics that has raised little attention in and outside of the island, and that is the use of slavery images in Leal's restoration project. Let us take a closer look. Located in the heart of Havana's historic district, the Panaderia Dulceria San Jose bridges the temporal distance between past and present. The two-story building stands in the highly trafficked Obispo Street. If you go to Havana today, you will certainly walk down Obispo Street, which is 1 block away from the Plaza de Armas, a very sort of a colonial plaza where the Spanish government held its most important institutions. So the facade is colorfully adorned with a mural depicting a colonial market. In it, 19th century street vendors move about a building of arched doorways. Behind them, we see a bell tower and a church, which is reminiscent of those churches that you will find in Old Havana if you visit. In fact, this is the Church of Santo Cristo, which is in the old colonial court too. In the right foreground over here, and you can see my mouse, right? Yes. In the right foreground, 2 men appear walking alongside each other. The white man wearing a broad hat and a jacket carries a basket on each hand. Next to him, a barefooted black man balances a large pot on his head branded with the word panadero, or baker or bread seller. Now, we also have to notice here that in the visual vocabulary of the 19th century, being barefooted on a public street like this is a sign of slavery. So you have here the barefooted figure. Now, the wall painting is a contemporary rendition of Frederick Miales's El Panadero y el Malojero, the baker and the hay seller, originally published in Viaje Pintoresco alrededor de la Isla de Cuba, which was a lithographic collection of views of the island. Lithographs like this lithograph depicts a busy street in front of the Church of Santo Cristo at the end of Amargura Street. The street is inhabited by universally picturesque characters. Near the center, we have, again, here's the bread seller or the baker and his black attendant hauling numerous baskets. These figures are framed by two other groups. On the left, here we have these two women who appear chatting. One wears a long mantle covering her head and arms, while the other one rests a basket on her head. Now, on the other side of the picture, we see the malojero or the hay seller pulling straw, removing straw from a large bundle on a horse. And behind him, there's another malojero looking back at us as he's riding on horseback. Like many of Miales's prints, the scene navigates between a local space and a global picturesque vocabulary. Bread and hay sellers were common in 19th century societies across the world. The women in long drapes and the basket overhead are also broadly used motifs in images of Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. What is at odds here is the seamless rendition of slavery. The figure of the barefooted black man hauling an extraordinarily large pot on his head sort of blends in within the composition as yet another picturesque element. Our eyes are distracted from his bonded condition and the strenuous labors that he performs. Instead, we are drawn to the intriguing horse covered in hay, the church architecture in the background, or the charming women. And this is sort of classical of picturesque representation. If you study 19th century images, artists are trying to create a sense of adventure within, a sense of discovery, where there are many different elements that are sort of competing for your attention. It's not necessarily a centralized composition. So this is also a way that slavery becomes sort of diluted within the image. So in turn, the practice of slavery shown here front and center is gracefully diluted. Now, the mural at the Panaderia Dulceria San Jose carries many of the elements that veil the representation of slavery on the wall. The painting ties the state-run bakery to a picturesque colonial bread seller of yesteryear. It reconnects the city and their visitors to a previous, supposedly simpler time when bread was hauled around by an enslaved black man. This last detail is not immediately revealed to the viewer. In fact, most people who walk down Obispo Street or who patronize the Panaderia do not recognize the representation. Commenting on this now picturesque site, a correspondent of Havana's radio described the storefront painting as, and I quote, "A beautiful costumbrista mural that reminds us of the sale of the precious food," which is referring to bread, loudly advertised in our streets and plazas, custom that perseveres unto today. End quote. Accounts like this reveal the true power of such visualization. The image's picturesque vocabulary is used to draw clients in, yet its history of slavery hides in plain sight, invisible to the untrained eye. In turn, the image acts upon urban life without calling attention to the problems it represents. During the past 3 decades, Miales's lithographs have emerged from the history books onto the streets. They are common in souvenir shops, restaurant displays, and murals like the facade of the Panaderia San Jose. In fact, next to the Panaderia, next to this very business, there's a local fashion boutique that takes its name, El Quitrin, from another one of Miales's lithographs. And this is, of course, a very famous print showing an enslaved black coachman driving white ladies across Havana's 19th century boulevard. So they have taken this name of El Quitrin, meaning this carriage, this horse-drawn carriage as their brand for the store. Now, these lithographs that once celebrated the urban imaginaries of a plantation elite have returned to reconnect the city to its colonial past and to bridge Cuba's transition into a capitalist future. The resurgence of Miales' images correlates with efforts to restore Havana's colonial core. During the 1980s, the old city lay in ruins, its buildings neglected and at the brinks of collapse. In the following decade, the disintegration of the Soviet Union would force Cuba's socialist government to re-enter global capital markets via the tourism economy. Such project entailed reanimating Havana's colonial heritage and its previous connection to the Atlantic world. And we have to remember too that the 1990s is a moment where Spain becomes Cuba's sort of partner in crime in setting up this tourism economy. So Cuba's colonial history becomes a tool for diplomatic relations and to lure back Spanish investment from the European Union into the restoration of the city. So to fund the restoration projects, Eusebio Leal founded a self-sustaining corporation called Abaguanex. The corporation built and managed a network of hotels, bars, restaurants, including the Panaderia Dulceria San Jose, and invested tourist dollars in further urban development and social programs. With money at hand, Leal and his team began to look back into the 19th century lithographic records. Given their extensive coverage of the colonial city, these prints became de facto historical sources for architects and restorers tasked with replenishing the splendor of the old Havana. In addition to providing a breadth of historical materials, picturesque albums had already constructed global imaginaries of Cuba. Their visual language looked back into a time when the island was highly connected to the Atlantic via the plantation economy. There were reminders that before the Soviets, Cuba was indeed part of the West. Leal's renovation would carry the language of the 19th century picturesque into these newly built spaces. For example, the Plaza Vieja and the Plaza de Armas were transformed into their former images. So both of these plazas were actually reconstructed based on 19th century lithographs. We can take a minute to flesh this out. So for example, here you see the restoration. The Plaza Vieja was the ground zero of the restoration project, one of the very early projects. And after a series of discussions and some disagreements, it was decided that it would take the form of this lithograph by a French traveler, drafted during the 1820s. And although you don't see this market here anymore, this fountain, for example, is one of the key features of the plaza. This sort of fence around it is also very typical of the 19th century. And this colonnade where commerce is on the bottom and then the living quarters on top. So once they changed the architecture space of the plaza itself, they also restored the buildings around it to match that time period. Here's, for example, a picture of the plaza being restored in the 1990s. Another really interesting example too is the Plaza de Armas. Again, this is a sort of center of the Spanish colonial government in the island. And the restoration reconstructed a design from the early 19th century. Even though there were many restorations after that, there were many other designs after the 1830s. For example, in the early 20th century, we have this rotunda, a much more fluid structure than than this landscape design of a cross and a grid-like pattern with 4 gardens that are fenced in. And you can see, of course, here's another lithograph by Miale of the 1840s showing that design. Again, this is a Plaza de Armas again, from the 1840s, that grid-like design with sort of like a cross, meaning at the statue of Ferdinand VII, the Spanish king. And we also have to remember that when Miale was drafting these lithographs, he was also looking at a city that was built anew by administration of Miguel Tacón, right? Miguel Tacón was a Spanish governor who ruled during the 1830s, and he took a lot of money that was being made in the sugar plantation economy to run this very large renovation and urbanization campaign in the 19th century. So there is a conscious decision on behalf of the Office of the City Historian to go back to this time period of the 1830s and 1840s. Now, the images jump from the printed page onto the architecture testifies to the growing scale of its influence. This material transfiguration is now projects imaginaries of a former slave society onto real and tangible space. The print's enlargement as architectural feature allows us to inhabit the picture of colonial Havana. And this is explicitly built in the mural of the Panaderia San Jose. On the center left, a window invites visitors to pose for a photograph alongside the life-size 19th century figures. The gesture allows tourists to partake in the making of a picturesque illusion, to physically enter the image and become one of its parts. Right? It's really forward. To be part of the image is to be sort of in the illusion of colonial Havana. Such photographs will carry on Havana's 21st century picturesque onto social media and fuel interest of other travelers around the world. Yet, few will notice the enslaved man on the wall. His presence and labor, are necessary for the representation. His pain and exploitation must be colored over. After all, tourists do not travel thousands of miles to be confronted by uncomfortable histories of slavery. In its most elemental definition, the picturesque is that it's an art of capturing landscapes and scenes of everyday life, which nature resembles a painting, right? It's something that merits representation. Our historians have long discussed the politics of this artistic style and its ability to mask over violence, exploitation, and environmental destruction. This mural that we're seeing here, like the lithographs that it reproduced, hides a grim reality. Behind the colorful walls of the old city, an underworld of sex trafficking preys on young Cuban women and men, particularly those with darker skin. The recycling of a slave society's imaginaries signals to the unearthing of previous racial prejudices, a subject that Jill Lane reflected upon some years ago. Today, white Europeans flock to Cuba looking for sexual encounters with Black others. The constant scarcity of food and the basic commodities that Cubans endure daily make for an abundant sex market. It is a job of the picturesque image to dissimulate this uglier side, to superimpose itself on the exploitation and the sexual violence engendered by the new tourism economy. Now, I want to offer a little bit of a more personal take on this, because I have been traveling to Havana for a number of years dealing with this image, and I haven't found not yet a way to make sense of it. So regardless of the criticism that I express here, Havana's restoration project is highly celebrated both locally and internationally. The foreign press often reports on it as an example of sustainable development, and Habaneros speak of Eusebio Leal with affection and admiration. Today, thousands of people walk by the San Jose bakery without knowledge of the image in its facade, where it came from, or without even noticing that there is an enslaved man in the picture. Sitting in one of Havana's touristic cafes, I expressed my frustration to a cultural professional in the office of the city historian. She replied that my reading was indeed incomplete because I did not consider that the image as part of a strategy for survival. After all, she mentioned, Black Cubans too profit from the sale of souvenirs and the live reenactments of these colonial imaginaries, even if they implicitly reference slavery. Some years later, I had a very similar conversation with a Black woman in Cartagena, Colombia. She was a street vendor offering a figurine that I had seen in Havana's souvenir markets. Knowing that these objects derived from a racist colonial archive, I denied. I later explained that I could not purchase the item because where I live, these figurines are considered racist. She was surprised and responded, quote, "This is not racist. She looks just like me," end quote. These conversations testify to the complex ways on which racialized images are commercialized in the Caribbean today. They form part of local economies of subsistence while perpetuating racial attitudes that marginalize Black people across the region. It remains unclear whether the Caribbean tourism industry can survive without trailing behind this phantom of slavery and colonial exploitation. Until such is decided, the San Jose mural will continue to greet visitors eager to grab a taste of the colonial city. Thank you.
Thank you, Asiel. We are ready for questions there then. Who want to be the first one?
I have a question. So in the picture where it says this is a picture of the author, that's you, right?
Yeah, that's me.
Do you have a book that you've written that you want to tell us about?
Oh, it's in the process.
Okay.
So this is actually my dissertation research that I am, soon will be turning it into a book. And I really enjoy that picture because of me looking at the mural itself, because it's a way of acknowledging the presence of this figure that is so public but yet sort of hidden in plain sight. I've been told by some people that I should use that picture as a sort of the author photographing a book.
Yeah, it looks like you're part of the scene.
Yes, that's what it's meant. That's what that window is meant to do.
Yeah.
Medardo, do you want to say something? Your mic is off.
Yeah, I was gonna comment also something similar, that the way the window is located in the picture provides certain type of interactive element to the piece, where it seems like both present and past are colliding, and you almost are in that picture in the same scale as the characters. And I think like exploring that the configuration, the placement of the window, and not only as a picture but as an installation where people can almost be part of the picture itself. It becomes another thing when you are in the picture. It becomes another thing when the window it's closed. It seems like the mural it's changing with whoever interacts with it. I don't know if what do you feel about it?
I completely agree with that. Yes, and this is why because I saw tourists taking pictures here, and I realized, oh, this is already built in the reconstruction of this building, right? By the way, also see how the mural itself is framed by this architectural feature. So it's a way to transpose an image that is a print, it's a small print, into a very large public architectural display. But there is a sense that when you walk through Havana, this is why I chose this picture too. When you walk through Havana, there is a sense that the colonial city, that you are inhabiting the colonial city. And so the restoration project has made an effort to do that, to curate a type of experience. For example, if you, right now, probably it's not happening because of COVID, but if you walk down the Plaza de Armas, I think it's on a Sunday morning, you will find a classical orchestra playing, and this was something that was done during the 19th century. So the historians have been looking back into many of the customs and uses of Havana during the 19th century, and they used the word recuperating that heritage. I think that in recuperating that heritage, there hasn't been a conversation about the racial element of it and the fact that this heritage is one of a plantation society.
And also, I wanted to ask you if you have considered, there's a painting from the 16th century. It's a Portuguese painting called Chafariz del Rey. And it shows also a square with a lot of Black people circulating the public area. And it's almost the same configuration of the one that you're showing. I mean, like, I'm just saying this. I know that at the 19th century pictorial, with that, you have a lot to deal with. But it's remarkable how similar it is. I will share the link on the chat.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, any other question for Asiel? Thank you, Medardo.
Yeah, that's really, it really is an interesting image. It's much more different than those 19th century images of Havana, because the images of Havana are not as highly populated as that images.
Yeah.
It's very much structured. The pictorial experience is very much an experience that wants to make you believe that this is actually a real space, but it's a very constructed space.
Yeah.
I was going to add that I see Maria has her hand up. I don't know if you saw Alberto on there as well.
Thank you. Yes, I do. Well, thank you for your presentation. I enjoyed it a lot. I'm a high school Spanish teacher, and I work, 60% of our population is African American, and 40% is mostly Hispanic. And I'm always looking for ways of engage the students in a way that they feel part of the Spanish class. Recently, we had the AP Literature and Culture exam, and I noticed that one of the skills that my students didn't get quite right was the comparison between art or pictures. And you have given us an amazing resource of how we can bring in all these pictures and compare with the different cultures. Many of my students are Muslims, and you mentioned that even the way the women are dressed in these pictures are very similar to the ones in Spain or from the Moor culture. And so I just wanted to thank you for that, because you are giving us a great resources to do that. So thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely. That woman and that pair of women in the side of the image is that's when you can see that these artists are using sort of broadly Orientalist motives of, carrying a basket on their head or that sort of drapery. It's not necessarily unique of Cuba, but you're right. When you understand the sort of visual vocabulary, you can find that detail in many images around the world.
Yes, thank you. Also for Dr. Rosario, thank you for mentioning also, it was something that I said in my classroom, that the Hispanic culture is a mixture of the African and the Spaniard and the indigenous. And so I thank you for clarifying that for me. And I never thought or I never got the idea of course, the Hispanics were experiencing the migration from the Moor and the Jewish colonies in Spain. And so, yes, the Spaniards weren't like pure Spaniards, Catholic Spaniards. We had all these people from all these cultures coming into the Americas. So yes, it's something that I never thought before, and I appreciate that too.
Thank you for calling, Maria.
Thank you.
Well, I have a question, Asiel. I was wondering if there is any study that compares the aesthetics of the plazas in the Habana Vieja, because, well, at least for me, there is a big difference, for example, between La Plaza de Armas, how it's constructed right now, and for example, La Plaza Vieja. You were showing some images about it.
You mean studies comparing the two plazas or comparing their sources?
Well, the plazas, because there are more than two in the case of Habana Vieja, no? There's anything about that you have found during these years studying that?
Not necessarily. I think I found materials that detail the restoration of the plazas and the sort of discussions that went behind doors of selecting sources for the restoration. I don't know of a specific study that does a sort of architectural comparison between the different plazas in the city. That would be interesting. I mean, Joaquin Weiss has this book on architecture, Cuban architecture, that is it's always a good source, but he's pretty much narrating sort of long direct history of architecture in the island.
Well, that's good to know, because, well, there is a vacuum there that probably can be explored in the next years. So, and you also need to tell me in the future how to get upstairs, because in my many years living in Havana, I didn't have the opportunity never to be where you were. Okay, so you need to pass me that contact, please. Okay, so we still have more time. I'm not sure if there are more questions, or we can go. Oh, Denise, do you want to say something?
Yes, thank you both, Dr. Rosario and Dr. Sepulveda, for your presentation. I have a question for Dr. Sepulveda. In the experience of seeing these restored paintings and being able to, even as we mentioned before, there's this performative aspect and interactive aspect of being able to go into the balcony. Is it part of a walking tour? Who's guiding? Is there, a sort of historical infrastructure for presenting these images to travelers?
So, yes. So there's not specifically a tour that includes this image, but there are tours around Havana formally through government agencies or by people on the streets who have learned the history, and then they take you around. And one of the stops in that tour is to grab coffee in this shop. When Havana was open to the cruises, because this is so close to the harbor, the cruise ship tourists will go and stop on the bakery, because it's one of those things, you smell the Cuban coffee, and it's very attractive. So there is the whole, if you go to that street, you are overwhelmed by the performance of the colonial city. So one of the things that you'll find next to it, for example, is on a Tuesday lunch, a band of musicians just like playing salsa like it's on Saturday night, And I always commented that to when I sat down to eat it in there, how even in Cuba, you're not really dancing salsa on a Tuesday lunch. That's when the tourism economy becomes sort of affects the city to the point that now even the behavior of people is sort of geared towards that. So there is many elements of performance. There are women that are dressed up and men that are dressed up in these various colonial figures, sort of reenacting pictures, not only of Cuba, but sort of the Bahiana, this sort of Pan-African figure from Brazil. So yes, there are many elements of performance within the space, the architectural space of the city.
Thank you. And I just had a quick follow-up question for Dr. Rosario. I read recently Jill Tulliver's book on engaging Blackness in Afro-Latino contemporary literature. And she has a chapter on claiming Blackness in Puerto Rico post-Civil War. She uses P.D. Thomas's Down These Mean Streets as an example of how in the imaginary, the perception on the island is that of whiteness, whereas the perception of those who leave the island is that of Blackness, or that the community then assumes or claims this Blackness. And then by default, then those on the island see any of those that left as habitating or inhabiting these spaces of Blackness. And so I was just wondering your thoughts on that, because it's something that my students and I discuss often when reading P.D. Thomas's memoir, is how, since he never goes to the island, it's forcing him to reconcile his Blackness.
Yeah, I think yes, I completely agree with what you're saying and the experience that it's described. I think, for example, to give that example, anecdotal example, in Puerto Rico, the University of Puerto Rico, we are all Puerto Ricans. So we are considered a Hispanic institution, a minority institution, but there's not necessarily an awareness of students that they are considered like that because they're in the island. So it's very interesting to see the reactions when students, for example, of sciences, they go to minority conferences and they have to face the reality that they are being placed and considered as the communities that in the island are marginalized. And that's something that I think that type of, you can call it awakening or realization of how you are being perceived often takes place away of the island, unless you are in very specific pockets where negritude is celebrated and you grow up with an acknowledgement of that phenomenon. That idea that by the movement of people from the island to the US, there's a transition to Blackness. It's fascinating and wonderful, no? But I do think when I think about the presentation, and I do think that the shared experiences between the two communities, there seems to be recognition, a reflection that fosters that recognition. I think more than answering your question, I'm agreeing with what you're saying, because and it's so interesting to see how students react to that and how they perceive the Puerto the island, and how that gets complicated with language and the possibility to talk or not Spanish like the Puerto Ricans, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Thank you.
Maria, do you have your hand raised again?
Who, me?
Yeah. No,
Yeah,
Maria.
no, I'm sorry. No, I wanted to say something, but I don't know if anybody else wants to say anything.
Okay.
Which besides thanking Alberto for putting together this fantastic workshop, I also would like to put in a plug for my 19th century literature graduate course, because one of the things that we're going to deal with in there is just that, the pictorial representation and, the similarities in this 19th century social structure, the racial social structure. We're going to read Cecilia Valdez. And Alberto's comment about the plazas is very interesting because in the Cuadro de Costumbres, the sketch of customs and manners, the plazas are always a topic. This is the main topic, you know, where more than anything else, because it supposedly shows the interaction of different racial groups, you know, different groups that come together. So they are sort of places, you know, where this takes place. And thank you very much. I'm trying to get out of here.
No, it's fine. I think that for the first time in these 3 days, we're going to be able to take a break between talks. So we will continue with Corina at 11 as it was planned. Okay, so it's time for me to get a cafecito, and we will be back at 11. Okay.
Thank you.
Hello?
Hello.
Hey, well, we are here again for our last speaker. I am going to introduce Corina briefly, and I'm going to pass you the word, okay? Give me one second. So, Dr. Corina teaches at Florida International University. She's working on a book based on her PhD dissertation, which explores the role of global white supremacy on the development of Little Havana, Calle 8 Art District. She's creating a digital project highlighting Little Havana's little-known Black history. Before COVID-19, she led walking tours that promoted critical thinking about the role of the built environment on racial narratives and practices. In the past decade, she has become widely recognized for her civic leadership in Little Havana. She co-authored A History of Little Havana, a people history of the neighborhood, and has organized numerous efforts aimed at building civic engagement and ensuring equitable development in the gentrifying neighborhood. PBS featured her in its Woman Who Leads series, as did the National Trust of Historic Preservation in its Little Havana Me Importa exhibit. Calle 8 magazine made her an inaugural recipient of its Community Champion Awards. So she's important. That's what matters here. Corina, thank you for being here with us, okay?
It is a great pleasure. Thank you so much, Alberto. I'm going to do a share screen here. I should disclose that I am now living in, of all places, Baltimore, Maryland, but I'm staying connected. I'm trying to figure out how to live bi-regionally, but I am spreading the love and awareness about Miami, Little Havana, the Cuban diaspora here in a new city. So, and I also am the director of research and education for a public engagement firm called Justice and Sustainability Associates, which is all about making sure that there's equitable access to planning and transportation decisions in communities. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm drawing on my dissertation research for my presentation today. But since this is, Spanish for business, I thought I would really highlight entrepreneurs, and specifically Afro-Cuban entrepreneurs in Little Havana, and especially in this area I'm going to talk a little bit about, which is the what I call the heritage district of Little Havana. Oops. So Little Havana, what most tourists see and folks who read travel articles about Little Havana see, is actually just a small portion of the bigger neighborhood, Little Havana. I'll show you a map shortly, but this is an area that encompasses, you've probably heard of Calle 8, but it's on Calle 8, and it's between 13th and 17th Avenues in Miami. This is where you see the tour bus stops. This is where the walking tours take place. It does include a small portion of Cuban Memorial Park, and millions of tourists. Even during COVID, you still had tourists coming into Little Havana. It's one of the #1 places in Miami that tourists go to now. It has a history of being part of what was called the Latin Quarter. This was an idea generated among predominantly male Cuban emigres who wanted to build a relationship actually with Anglos. And I'm saying Anglo whites in particular, because of concerns about the reputation that the Cuban community was experiencing in the 1970s, when you had paramilitaries and you had a reputation that for bombings and violence in Miami and in Little Havana that was really damaging the reputation of the respectability of the Cuban emigre community. So this was the space that became the home to what started in the 70s, the huge Calle festival that kind of put Calle on the map around the world. Hundreds of thousands of people come, I mean, not hundreds of thousands, but over 100,000 people, even in the early years of this festival. It's also, this is like a key site for political campaigns from people want to be president to mayors to state representatives. And it has become this symbol beyond just the material space, has become this symbol of Cubanidad, and a place that I talk about in my writings for telling the Cuban success story. So here's a map. It just shows you how small this is in comparison to the rest of the neighborhood. These boundaries are not rigid, but oftentimes Little Havana is thought to go to 27th Avenue. This is downtown Miami, and East Little Havana actually has a large Central American immigrant population, which is rapidly gentrifying. The prices are out of control in Miami right now, and Little Havana included. And so you do see more Anglos moving into the neighborhood, a lot of displacement going on. But there's also a narrative that there are no Cubans in Little Havana anymore, and that's not true at all. It's just that it's a very diverse population in terms of cohorts of emigres, also Cuban Americans that also live in the neighborhood. So this is if you go to the National Trust for Historic Preservation website, they have a page specific, or a little section just focused on Little Havana. This is from that page. And this is a photo of from the Heritage District, and it's looking at these wonderful rooster sculptures that you see everywhere in the district. And, but this rooster on the right is in front of a place that promotes itself as the Little Havana Visitor Center. And this is worthwhile mentioning for a reason I'll bring up soon. And this, it is because the National Trust named Little Havana a national treasure and calls it a, you know, the Latino Ellis Island, okay? So it got a lot of publicity about that. But the representation of Little Havana, of course, is the Heritage District, right? Which of course, and it doesn't have much representation of these other communities like Central American communities in the district at all. So what I argue in my research is that it is constructed right now as this sort of multicultural and inclusive space, like the "we are all Cuban" narrative, right? But it is very focused on, when you see what the tour guides are, when you listen to what the tour guides are saying, what's being written about in travel magazines, it's all about celebrating this idea of white Cuban entrepreneurship, invisibilizes Black entrepreneurship. There is very little mention of Afro-Cubanidad, except when you go into Cuban Memorial Park and when people go to the ceiba tree and say, look at these animal sacrifices and Santeria. And it's sort of like it's the exotic, primitive sort of stereotype that people bring with them, oftentimes as tourists, and it kind of highlights that, that imagery. And so there's this manufacturing of ideas, and this has been written about in the scholarship, of Blackness as sort of primitive or violent, because there's also a narrative of the Mariel boat lift being, oh, that was the horrible time in Little Havana, and these Mariel Cubans came and it decimated the neighborhood, and now we're making Little Havana great again. And so there's that narrative as well about the many Afro-Cubans that were coming in that particular cohort in 1980. And so it's like this Black body, white mind dichotomy that gets set up. At the same time, in the district, you have a lot of tourists of African descent coming in to Little Havana, patronizing the shops. This photo on your right is from Azúcar Ice Cream. And it's on their About Us page, but this is not a, it almost makes it seem like it's a Black-owned business, but it is not in any way. You also have a history of racial profiling in Little Havana. That continues to this day. I will talk about that. You have a history of racial discrimination in the local housing market against people of African descent, including Afro-Cubans. And you have a lot of racial discrimination disparities in the tourism industry. Who gets hired? Who's telling the stories about Little Havana and about the Cuban community? This is a very recent, this is from the last week. This is from the Facebook page of the head of Multicultural Heritage Tourism Division of the Greater Miami Convention and Visitors Bureau. And I want you to see that image of Celia Cruz on the wall. This is right on Calle Ocho. And this is going out in their statement about Cuba. But you see, this is the image. It's like a Jim Crow type image of Celia Cruz that tourists see. In fact, when you eat at the outdoor restaurants, this is what you're looking at across the street, is this kind of an imagery of Celia Cruz. So I want to talk a little bit about the Cuban American success story. On your left, by the way, I use the archive at the Cuban Heritage Collection, and I really enjoyed looking through the Continental National Bank calendars. This Continental National Bank was the first Cuban American bank. It was founded in Little Havana. That's where its home base was. And they produced these calendars that showed up on bakeries and storefronts. And this was this imagery of white Cubanidad, very much so. And here you see good old Christopher Columbus with his star on the Calle Ocho Walk of Fame, which is in the Little Havana Heritage District. And if you note the contrast here in the one Afro-Cuban, obviously Afro-Cuban person, the way he is depicted compared to the others in this drawing. Below, you see one of many, many sort of civic rituals that take place in one of the plazas in the heart of the Little Havana Heritage District. And here you hear this narrative over and over again of the Cuban success story. And so, it's a version of the American dream, which Ta-Nehisi Coates calls the white dream. And what it does is it really emphasizes this idea of self-made folks. We worked hard. That's all we needed. We were just the most hardworking folks. We had the work ethic, this entrepreneurial spirit, and but it ignores some things. And I do want to show, this is another image from the calendar, which just sort of underlines this idea of the American dream as the sort of the white or the whitening dream. And this is this sort of imagery of the suburbs and this sort of solidarity, Anglo-Cuban solidarity. So what the Cuban success story ignores is the privileges that favored the golden exile cohort that are elevated in the Cuban success story and in the narratives that are told by tour guides over and over and over again in the district itself. It ignores history of Cubans who arrived prior to 1959 as if all of a sudden, there were Cubans living in the area that was called Little Havana before. And we know about communities, of course, in New York and Tampa and Key West. Ignores the diversity of the Cuban diaspora, ignores the contributions of folks who came in later cohorts, especially 1980 and later, and especially their contributions to the vitality of the district today. And as Alan Aja says in his book on Afro-Cubans in Miami, it depends on an unspoken Cuban whiteness. This, I pointed out earlier, the Little Havana Welcome Center. Well, this is on their passport. It's a little brochure they give out for free to tourists. And there are many tourists, busloads of tourists go into the store. And I just want you to know that when you open it up, this is what you see. If there was any talk about, visual depictions of racial order, I don't think you can get more blatant than this idea, which rolls in with this idea of Columbus and the sort of I'm the navigator, even the espuma on top of the Cuban coffee, and the sort of the whiteness going down into, again, more Jim Crow-esque depictions of Blackness as just the performers, the musicians, but the body, and we are the explorers and the navigators and the mind. So you have a lot of tokenizing of Black bodies in Little Havana. Celia Cruz, over and over again, you see her image, okay? But it's just Celia Cruz. And then you see, this is a welcome mural to Little Havana, and there's this sort of dynamic of whiteness and blackness and whiteness, black beans and white rice, and the dominoes, and the white conga player in front of the hand of the black conga player. And across the street, an image of a Black woman dancing with a socially white man. You also have statues of Afro-Cuban men, interestingly enough, in Cuban Memorial Park. I don't have time to go into great depth, but there's a bust of Antonio Maceo, and there is this particular mercenary, Tony Izquierdo, who was a counter-revolutionary. This is the only statue of a named identified person in all of Cuban Memorial Park. So you see that. You also see, as I was mentioning before, these narratives, or you hear these narratives about Blackness. So, you know, these negative images that were being circulated about the Mariel, they continue in the tour narratives of today, especially in the way people talk about the ceiba tree that you see here, which is very prominent in Cuban Memorial Park. And you also have, I actually took this class on tour guiding offered by Miami-Dade College, and they actually distributed this clipping on voodoo boutiques talking about sacrificing of dogs and cats. I'm like, what? I mean, just complete distortions of Afro-diasporic religions. So based on what you've learned so far, and I would love to see in the chat, I would love to see what kinds of, or even actually you could just say it out loud. Oops, I'm giving it away. What presence do you think there is in this little district of Afro-Cuban entrepreneurs, and what businesses might folks be doing, or what do you think? Any thoughts? Do you think that there's a lot of entrepreneurs, no entrepreneurs? Maybe certain kinds of jobs?
A lot of them.
Yes, there are more than you think. Musicians, okay. Show, okay. Thank you, Celeste.
Street vendors.
Yes.
Of peanuts vendors.
Okay.
It's very close to my home. I used to see them a lot.
Okay, so how about if I tell you this? 2 out of 6 cigar shops in the district are owned by Afro-Cubans. And one of those has like over 1,000 5-star reviews on TripAdvisor. It's a relatively new shop. I'll be talking about that. 2 of the most popular Cuban restaurants in the district, Old Havana and Salao's, are owned by the same Afro-Cuban man. A locksmith I'll talk about is based right next to the district, literally right next, and that's a multi-generation family business. One of the most famous Afro-Cuban folkloric dancers in the US lives in Little Havana, right next to the main plaza of the district, and teaches in Little Havana. She has taught at least in 2 different dance studios in Little Havana, and she performs, but she has international exposure at this point. Another, he no longer lives in Little Havana because he was priced out, but one of the most famous Afro-Cuban drummers and drum makers in the US used to live in Little Havana. And I was just talking in the past a month or so with an Afro-Cuban woman who grew up in Little Havana, who is starting her own tour business as a tour guide in Little Havana. This is not to say, I also should mention that there are artists, there are sometimes vendors, there are folks, there's a very robust economy of Santeria and Palo and Afro-Cuban religions as a business too, not just religion. This is the way people make a living and all the materials, resources that are connected to that. So this sort of defies this image that we have, right, of the presence of Afro-Cuban entrepreneurs. So I talk about this idea of Black placemaking and trickster economics. And when I think of the trickster, I think of the Elegua, and if you saw the wonderful documentary on Rumba, you saw you saw a little bit or heard some of the sacred music of Elegua. But he is the Orisha, or divinity, who opens the way. He sits at the crossroads. But there's a very famous pataki, or story about him, that I think is worthwhile thinking about. And it's a story about two friends, best friends. They live right next to each other, and everybody knows about their friendship, and Elegua decides to test their friendship. So for 20 days, he walks on the borders of their property, and sometimes he appears as a Black man, and sometimes he appears as white. Or some people say he wears red and wears black. There's many variations of the story. So they make it a point of conversation to talk about, oh, did you see the guy in red, or did you see the Black guy who walked on the property line again this morning? And they do that for 20 days until the 21st day. And that's when, like the Harlequin, he appears one way to one neighbor and another way to the other neighbor. And that's when they start to fight. They come to blows because they only see one side. They don't see the other side. They don't see the whole. And so when I talk about trickster, I'm talking about this kind of way to negotiate in the face of white supremacy, in the face of racist structures and systems that you're forced to navigate as a business owner, as an entrepreneur, in a space that was designed to be very much controlled and dominated by the same Cuban emigre businessmen that were in charge of the Latin Quarter. And so you have very strong organizations, Viernes Culturales, the Kiwanis of Little Havana, absolutely dominated by white Cuban men to this day. Although that's changing with Viernes Culturales a bit. So, and that relates to this idea of trickster economics as well. And how do you create a space in a space where you're excluded? So I have identified, this is just 4 different ideas. There's many different strategies, but I see certain patterns of what I call masking, alliances and brokers, specialized knowledge, and what I call secret weapon. I'll talk about those later. First, I want to give historical context. I don't think I need to go into great depth here. I know we've talked a lot about history so far in this program, but I just want to emphasize that we have to think transnationally, and we have to think about this ongoing relationship between the US and Cuba. And I think it's interesting to note that you have the relationship between plantation owners, you have the relationship of these ideas and ideals of freedom and independence, but at the same time, you have broken promises. So you have the idea of we are all Cuban, the color blindness, we don't see color, it's inclusive, but at the same time, you have exclusion from the interiors of parks, from schools, from economic opportunities, from educational opportunities, from political opportunities. In Florida, you have the Black codes. In the South, you have the Jim Crow laws going on. So there's this dynamic, and there's a communication going on and a learning about these types of things. You have convict leasing. So all these kinds of dynamics of broken promises and the threat of violence are very clearly in the minds of folks who are thinking about how you're going to survive economically. And speaking of the presence of Cubans in the United States before 1959, I'd like to take us to Tampa, where you have the Afro-Cuban entrepreneurs, Paulina and Roberto Pedroso, who were patriots. They had a rooming house. That is an entrepreneurial venture. And in that rooming house, Jose Marti came many times, and they helped link him to opportunities with speaking. They call, Paulina's been called the Black mother of Jose Marti because of their close connection to each other. And you had this diversity in the Cuban communities in Tampa and Ybor City, where you had Cubans with Sicilians, with African Americans working side by side in the cigar factories that were there. But you had the impact of the influence of racial segregation, not just happening in the US, also in Cuba. So it's not just like it was just because of Jim Crow that you had the segregation of what had been the most important Cuban social club in Tampa, so that it became whites only. But you also had in 1910, the lynching of 2 Sicilian immigrants who were, and this was something that was happening to folks who showed too much solidarity or alliance with people of African descent or labor organizing. So this sort of threat of violence was affecting many folks who realized, wow, the only way that I might be able to separate myself is to either emphasize my Cuban identity over my African heritage or any alliance with African Americans, or to emphasize my whiteness, and that but it came through this idea of anti-Blackness in many cases. And after that lynching, the Pedrosos leave and they go back to Cuba. But you also have the idea of possibilities, and you had the formation of the Partido de Independiente de Color, this black political party, but was really thinking about opportunities across the board. This idea of broken promises, and so you have these economic ventures happening, but you have backlash. And you have backlash in the US and you have the backlash in Cuba. So you have the 1912 massacre of thousands of men, women, and children in Cuba. And this was supposedly, through the idea of Santeria and cannibalism and all these ideas that were spreading, also that the Partido de Independiente de Color was a threat. And so there was a brutal killing of the leaders of the party and many just local folks in Cuba. What a way to say, stay in your place, don't make waves, or this kind of violence can happen to you. And that was what the function of the Ku Klux Klan and other vigilante groups across the South was trying to say. Know your place, stay in your racial order. Continuing even after the promise of the Cuban Revolution and opportunities, okay, we desegregate the schools, but you still see broken promises, even under, Fidel Castro, for all this, talk about inclusion. And you also have that continuing into the present day. And this was very much captured by, has anybody here read this article, Best of Friends, Worlds Apart? It's a very famous New York Times Pulitzer Prize winning article by Mirta Ojito, talking about these 2 best friends. These guys were best friends in Cuba. They both came to Miami, and it follows their trajectory about how Ahmed was embraced and given all the kinds, immediately job opportunities. Hey, come here, I know a place for rent in my neighborhood. And he goes on this trajectory of success, and Joel is not offered that, and he ends up working in a low-wage job in an African-American community. And it kind of shows how this sort of process happened. And so you have these continued barriers that folks are facing. So now for the rest of the time, I just want to talk about, with that historical and present day context in mind, what are some of these strategies and who's using them? And they're not mutually exclusive. People are drawing upon these different strategies at different times, or in certain cases, never using some of these strategies. So El Esteban Mena is the owner of Old Havana and Salau's restaurant. Old Havana is in a prime spot. It's literally right next to the famous Domino Park in Little Havana. He's been very, very successful. Joe Caraballo is the owner of a longtime famous Miami locksmith. Caraballo locksmith has multiple. It's like a chain now in Miami. But what they do is, El Esteban, if you go into his restaurants, there is no, the images are very sort of 1950s nostalgia, a lot of like images of whiteness and kind of almost stereotypical in a way. And so and even in his image, when he is in social media or whatever, it's easy to mistake his chef who's sitting on his right, okay, as the owner. Like, he's very subtle and does not like project himself very overtly as the owner of these restaurants. And Caraballo, a lot of folks do not know that this is a Black-owned business, except if you go and you look closely and you see the little bóveda, the ancestor altar in the Little Havana location. And they, so they're very subtle about the fact that it's, you know, Afro-Cuban owned. But I did notice on social media that they recently posted this rest in peace grandpa of the actual bóveda on Facebook. So I think that shifts. But this is this idea of, like the Elegua Pataki that I mentioned, of projecting one thing to mask the fact that it is a Black-owned business, almost as a way of protection. And so that is one strategy. Then you have what I call secret weapon. Oops, hold on. Yep, secret weapon. So did you guys know that the head of the Proud Boys is an Afro-Cuban guy from Little Havana? Anybody know? Okay, that's Enrique Tarrio. I'm super interested in him. He doesn't live in Little Havana right now, but he's worth mentioning as an example of how sometimes there is a trading off of saying, okay, well, I'm going to show so much alliance, kind of like that image from the calendar I showed you. I'm going to show so much alliance that you're going to need me because I can be your proof of that, you know, it is, because he'll say, no, Proud Boys is not a white nationalist entity. Look, how can it be white nationalist if I'm the chairman of the Proud Boys? And so it's kind of this trading off. Fortunately, I'm not aware of folks that I know personally or that I interviewed who are taking this role in Little Havana right now, but I think it's worth mentioning that this has also been used as a strategy of survival. It's a strategy in a way of survival. Another one is specialized knowledge. So Fernando Morales is the owner of the newest cigar shop in the district. It's become very successful. He was a cigar roller. He's multi-generation cigar roller. And this is one of the jobs that you get sometimes, is one of the job opportunities that has been open for Afro-Cubans over other types of jobs in Cuba. And so he capitalizes on that specialized knowledge. And instead, in his business, instead of not, you know, showing his face or making himself very obscure in his business presentation, he's there, he's present in the store, he has his photo and his story on his website, and he's like, I have this specialized knowledge, I have a personal story to share. That's also Ezequiel Torres, the drummer that I mentioned. He's an expert religious drummer, drum maker, and he's very much got this knowledge that people are interested, they want to learn more. So he has developed great relationships with the Smithsonian and the History Miami Museum, and with folks who pay him to teach him drumming, including Anglos, and also the work he gets in the religious community. And priests of Afro-Cuban religions also have this kind of specialized knowledge. People are interested in this specialized knowledge. And because of that, they are willing to pay money to have access to that specialized knowledge. And having those kinds of relationships are an important means of protection. If you look at even the history of the formation of La Regla de Osha, Lukumi, which is popularly known as Santeria, the whole idea of having godparents in the religion is very much like a means of security, because you can have white godchildren who have lots of money and they will look out for you, they will protect you, they will make sure nothing is going to happen to you because you're their godparent, and the racial difference does not matter. And then you also have one of the things I think is most powerful is this idea of alliances, solidarity, bridging social capital, okay? And so Marisol Blanco, you know, actually I was one of the folks who helped her in the very beginning. I you know, myself and a Colombian American woman, she and I got her out there on social media. We started promoting her, recruiting people to her classes. She quickly got a whole network of women in particular of all different backgrounds who were an ally to her success and trying to get her opportunities. That's powerful. And Cristobal Mena, who owns Top Cigars, started hosting these amazing rumba gatherings, monthly gatherings, and he is very proud of his Blackness, of his Afro-Cuban heritage. And these gatherings, people were finding out about them. We had folks from Puerto Rico, we had folks from other parts of the, you know, LA, New York, coming to these monthly gatherings. And there was this great feeling of solidarity. But these are also folks who purchase from him and promote him and help get the word out. But Cristobal also depends on specialized knowledge, which I'll talk about soon. And Carol Ann Taylor is not Afro-Cuban, she's African-American. But she opened the first souvenir shop, interestingly enough, in Little Havana. And she became a place to sell crafts, arts and crafts and things that were produced by Afro-Cubans. So that's what I mean by the broker, having something who's sort of your ally, well-connected. She also was the first person to really promote this idea of heritage tourism and neighborhood tourism. And what's interesting is that she used her own relationships with these white Cuban men, okay, in connections through being on the board of Viernes Culturales, to also help build tourism in other Black communities in Miami, in Little Haiti, in Overtown, in parts of Coconut Grove that were predominantly Black Bahamian. So she was leveraging things too. She was leveraging these alliances, but then in turn, leveraging them for others. And this all relates to placemaking, because if you have a space, right? If you have a business like Top Cigars, which can host a gathering, a monthly rumba gathering, the images on the right here are from that, from the monthly gatherings that used to take place there. And also if you have a strong social network. So there are two owners of Cuba Ocho on Calle Ocho have opened up their doors. They're not Afro-Cuban, but they are later arriving Cuban emigres. And they believe very strongly in celebrating Afro-Cuban contributions and heritage. So there's been a lot of religious, Afro-Cuban religious gatherings there, political gatherings, various kinds of, the Afro-Cuban Professionals Association has met there. So they've also played an important role in this placemaking. And it spills outdoors. So, you know, Marisol started teaching in a dance studio in the district, but then she got opportunities to dance in the plaza. But it wasn't just the dancing. She stayed dressed as Oshun, as a queen. This is Oshun is an Orisha in Lukumi in Santeria, but she stayed dressed as Oshun after that performance. She walked down Calle Ocho with this crown, and it was like making a statement that this is my space too. Like I belong here too, and not as this objectified in a negative, in a derogatory or a hypersexual way. As a queen, you know, I walk on Calle Ocho. These are folks hanging out at these gatherings you see that are indoors. Even the cigar at Top Cigars, the rumbas, people would flow out into the sidewalk and flow out into the street. And there's this idea of presence. Also, what's interesting at Top Cigars is that he will play music very loudly. And so he would play the music of Santeria. He would very loudly outside the presence. So it's like the power of the music going into the street. So these are other ways of making presence. But this is not without backlash. I was actually at Top Cigars at one of the rumbas when the police suddenly converged, and literally there were about like 3 or 4 police cars. They had folks in the SWAT gear. They were doing it, interestingly enough, during our Viernes Culturales is a monthly arts festival on the last Friday of every month. They decided to do a supposed raid with no grounds whatsoever, mind you. And he's not involved in any covert stuff either, but they made up this idea that they were gonna go and that they had to be, they were searching because he might have guns and drugs. It was all speculative. And it was a spectacle. It was a spectacle of humiliation. And interestingly enough, the only other entity they did that to was the LGBTQ owned the art gallery across the street owned by a gay Cuban man. So there has been, beyond just sort of the entrepreneurship, there's also been the space for some political change. And so these 2 wonderful women, identical twins, Yvette and Yvonne Rodriguez, they are owners of their own cigar company. And they have done a lot of events in Little Havana, specifically in the district. And this is another photo that you see them on the lower right, hanging out in front of Cuba Ocho after a commemoration of Antonio Maceo in the park. And there you see above a commemoration of Antonio Maceo that does not look at him as sort of this Black warrior figure, but as an abolitionist, as a diasporic change maker, hugely impactful figure, as a man who is very intelligent, not just this sort of the brawn to Jose Marti's brain. And so this is an article that was also published. It was published in El Nuevo Herald and also in the Miami Herald in English. And it relates to other articles where the Afro-Cuban, the Afro-Latino Professionals Association, which they founded, the twins founded, was also speaking about a blackface performance in a theater in Little Havana, speaking out about the lack of visibility of the Afro-Latino community. So it's been expanding over the years, the kind of statements and the kind of presence that's happening here. And so I just want to wrap up and say, these are some of the strategies that I've identified. And let's think about the trickster and the power of the trickster and the positive ways that you can negotiate even in repressive circumstances. And thank you, everybody. I hope you found it interesting, and I'm open for questions. And now I'm going to check out comments in the chat.
Thank you, Corina. Thank you. Questions? So, Luciana, go ahead, please.
Hello, congratulations for such an amazing presentation.
Mm-hmm.
I live very close to Little Havana, so I feel very identified. And I wanted to ask if you have noticed during the last 4 or 5 years, the consequences of political division and political parties, because white Cubans used to be of extreme right, and I don't know what is the percentage of people of other currents, or if this division, the Proud Boys and all these very sad movements affect the neighborhood.
Absolutely. Actually, what's very interesting is that there's a commissioner. We have commissioners in Miami, and a commissioner for Little Havana that got elected is Joe Carroyo. And Joe Carroyo is well known for saying some pretty, I just have to say it, racist things. It's kind of almost openly known. And he became very repressive in the neighborhood and started attacking some of the businesses that were trying to create more opportunities. Actually, you know, I had a grant for an Afro Ocho dance festival, and I had to back off because I knew he would never allow permits for the kinds of things that I was planning to have done by Marisol and her dance company in public spaces of Little Havana. So that's been postponed until somebody else is elected, honestly. But it also was sowing division, and it's very fascinating. He started currying favor among not folks from the Mariel, but folks like who had arrived in the 90s and later, and basically sort of saying, come over. So it was almost like, I can give you some access to power and to sort of a whitening, but you have to align with me, and you have to align with what I stand for. And he was very against other folks, other business owners. So he actually, there had not been this division before, and all of a sudden you had like a division among business owners in the district. And you had, and it's interesting because some of the folks who side with him have been big allies of hosting events for Afro-Cubans, but at the same time, what has happened is a lot of folks who are, you could say, very much to the right have started using that space as well. And I've seen fewer gatherings in that space. I don't think there's the same feeling of welcome. The rumbas had to end. Cristobal said, enough, I just don't want to deal with it anymore. I don't want to deal with being constantly harassed. He is a lawyer. I mean, he was trained in Cuba. He has a law degree. So he has been very successful in fighting back all the efforts to remove him through uses of code enforcement. But it's interesting that Commissioner Carroyo has used code enforcement as a weapon against other businesses in the neighborhood. He has a very powerful opponent in Cristobal, though, because he knows the law backwards and forwards, and he's not afraid to use it. He's not afraid to call out racism, write letters, you know, to the editor, or write letters to folks. So he uses his specialized knowledge as protection, but definitely there's division. Sorry for such a long-winded answer.
No, thank you. Any other question? Medardo, and later Asiel. Medardo, your mic is off.
Again, thank you for your wonderful presentation. I'm also puzzled and marveled by this figure of Enrique Tarrio, and
Yes.
I would like to know if you can talk more about how you see this figure in terms of what you're talking regarding the figure of the trickster.
Yes.
I feel like the politics of trickstery are very related with what Negron Montaner talks about the politics of Iberia in Puerto Rico, in Puerto Rico Jam. This idea of that through mimicry, there's a type of subversion, and that the colonial subject, by mimicking the oppressor, is not necessarily something completely negative, but that it's able to push certain agenda. And I remember listening in Democracy Now! A discussion about Enrique Tarrio, basically how these groups like Proud Boys are using certain figures of the Latin community to incorporate certain waves of the right-wing political movements of South America connected to dictatorships.
Yes.
And that would allow them to have certain visibility in mainstream media that constantly are accusing them of being racist.
Yes.
So I see that that fits pretty well, but I was wondering that you that are seem that you are following this figure closely.
Yes.
What do you think it's in for him? What you know, like, because it seems that it feels like at any moment it's a figure that they're gonna use and gonna move away once he, like, as long as he's useful. Yeah.
Well, I actually I'm writing an entire book. The book I'm writing about, which is based on my dissertation research, but then when Enrique Tarrio came on the scene, I was like, oh my gosh, he is so much in alignment with the arguments that I was making in my dissertation. So I see Enrique Tarrio as part of a pattern that has existed for many, many, many years of this idea of that draws on these ideas of Black masculinity. Mm-hmm. And I see him as sort of this re-embodiment of an idea of Antonio Maceo. It's not very well known that Antonio Maceo was fetishized as a figure in the United States, written about a lot in the newspapers, almost with this adoring, it's strange to think, right? An Afro-Cuban general, but this was this time too when cigars were being very popular, and there was this idea of we need to restore white male masculinity as women are becoming consumers and trying to demand their rights, and we need to reclaim our white masculinity. And when there's this constant portrayal of these sort of Black warriors, I call it the Black warrior figure. You think about Ogun, you know, like, or the Cimarron, the power of these kinds of spiritual, folkloric, mythological figures. And so there's this idea of sort of fortifying, like we will fortify ourselves, just like minstrelsy. We will fortify ourselves with this kind of violence that we need, but we will vilify it at the same time. Like Eric Lott talks about this idea of the desire and the disavowal, you know? So after Antonio Maceo, you look at, isn't it interesting that in Cuban Memorial Park, the first statue ever put into Cuban Memorial Park was of Antonio Maceo. It was the first statue of a Black general, of a Black general in the United States, in Cuban Memorial Park, installed not after 1980, in the 1970s. Few Afro-Cubans in Miami. After him, after the Antonio Maceo Brigade started giving the name Antonio Maceo a bad name among, you know, powerful Cuban emigres, it was like, we got to back off from that name. And then all of a sudden you see a statue of Nestor Izquierdo, one of the few Afro-Cubans involved in affiliated with Brigade 2506 and Bay of Pigs, and then later paramilitary efforts, including those in Latin America, including those connected with the dirty wars in Latin America. Yeah. So you have these sort of figures, and I see this idea, and you see other figures. And so in my book, I'm kind of tracing these figures and how these are sort of embraced in these times when there's this feeling of threat to white masculinity. But if you look in the history of Little Havana's Heritage District, there's this idea of like, well, we needed to be violent. And you can find in Cuban exile newspapers this idea like, we need to be like the Blacks. And we need a little bit of disorder so that we can put things back into the proper racial order. So this association of Blackness with disorder. I think that and what's interesting is that it also went into these ideas of Santeria and this idea of Black magic and there's something magical and powerful that we need access to. You think about Batista, Machado, Fidel, all used the symbolism and sometimes actually had, you know, palo cauldrons themselves, and invested also in these ideas of like scaring people through this association of a quote black magic. Notice Enrique Tarrio always wears eleques. His mother is a santera. He does not hide, and yet he says he does not practice it. And yet every time he goes out, he wears every single eleque, necklace of Santeria when he goes out and is hanging out with the white guys. I think that they will hold on to him because they see him as their secret weapon. They see him not just to protect for this place, but almost in a spiritual sense that he fortifies and protects them. And just in the way that Batista was, had his, I'm trying to think of the correct word in terms of in Palo for the cauldron, but he actually had it sent to, not Nigeria, like to Mali, and had a bull sacrificed to his prenda.
Ganga or
prenda. And he had it sent back. And that, so this is this idea of, I want this black warrior spirit, magical figure. I think that politics and religion are very much like this. And there's a lot of spiritual ideas that circulate that are much more powerful in and shaping of racial politics than we may acknowledge. So I don't think that they're going to reject him completely. But what's interesting, did you know that he sells Black Lives Matter t-shirts to make money for the Proud Boys? Talk about trickster. You can't get much trickster than that. And that he is a FBI informant. So he's like got this ambiguity. To me, he is totally a Legua, or Eshu maybe.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Karina. Asiel, are you there?
Yes. I just had a brief comment, more than a question. And
Sure.
I really enjoyed this action plan oriented approach that you have. Like, this is what we can do to navigate these type of environments, to create businesses, to establish alliances, I wonder how that is put to use, how the knowledge sort of, the interesting idea to me here, you're taking academic knowledge and you're applying, you're creating a sort of, again, an action plan for people to engage in placemaking, as you say. How do you, what are the sort of deeds that you do beyond the research?
Well, I am a big believer in this, in the solidarity and in the alliances. The more I read and learn about history, but also the more I'm embedded in everyday practices in specific places, I see how powerful that is. And if you really think about what the whole construct of race does, is it's dividing. Why were those two Sicilians lynched in 1910 in Tampa? It was because they were getting too close. There was too much. Why do you have racial segregation? You know, it's this idea of divide and conquer, divide and conquer. So to me, the opposite of divide and conquer is creating alliances, is creating ways to be in solidarity across the divisions, across the ideas of racial order, and sort of deconstructing it. But I also think it's finding, I would love to go to speak more in my sort of modeling here about sort of being able to change or deconstruct the narratives. And that's where I think Ana, the tour guide, is so powerful, that she can actually tell her story growing up in Little Havana. Her mother was a santera who had a house right next to where Domino Plaza is right now. It was destroyed for a parking lot. She was raided all the time by police. And I interviewed police officers who said that they saw their faces on photos in the prenda that she had, because she was also a palera. But it's kind of like, these are amazing stories that are best told, I think, by folks being able to have means of agency, to tell your own story, to have your own place. So I think sort of the surfacing the building of the relationships, the connections, because she does not have experience running a tour business. I do. So I'm mentoring her on how to do a tour business. You see, it's like, how do you build that? How do you create those connections? But I also think it's important to do critiquing too about, like, even with the masking, the trade-off of having to feeling like you have to sort of deny that you are the owner, like you have to use other folks in front of you as these intermediaries. It also reinforces this idea that, oh, there can't be a Black business owner of this business. Do you see what I mean? It's like things get reinforced too at the same time. So you may make some money, you may make lots of money as a business owner, but to what expense in terms of shifting these ideas of racial order? I'm not sure if I'm really answering your question, but I'm thinking about all of these things at the same time in my work.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Another question?
Luciana.
Oh, I'm sorry, that is my second question. That is the last one. That one of the most wonderful experiences of walking in the Little Havana is watching the totemic figure of the cock, the symbol of the cock, but watching behind the cock statues and the domino thing, the cocks walking in the secondary street and standing in the trees watching us, no? Yeah. I love that animal and I feel observed by them when I'm walking the Little Havana. So it's like a primitivist experience, and totemic also, if you look beyond the ordinary things. And we have a PhD student at FIU that he's living in Little Havana and he's Black.
Yes.
And he says that walking in his neighborhood, sometimes other Cubans, they don't talk to him because they think he's African American and they ignore him. But others, African Americans, they talk to him in English. He answers in his English and they ignore him. So say, I am transparent. I am very tall and I am transparent because they ignore me both. So I'm free. I can do whatever I want because everybody ignores me. So he's a very relevant intellectual figure, and I believe he will produce good contents of his experience in Little Havana. And I see as one remark that the Quebec Center, that is not exactly in Little Havana, but close, is functioning as an intermediation space for the African voices and for Latin American voices that are not heard or not permitted by the police or by the governmental authorities. And I believe this is the hope we have in these neighborhoods, to have places like this to grow and to develop.
Quebec, I actually was, when I was in Miami, was on the artistic advisory board. Yeah, absolutely. Actually, that's one of the places where Marisol is teaching. And it was one of the first places, bigger institutions that gave her a regular place besides a dance studio, but a lot of exposure, media exposure and things like that. Very, very supportive. Interesting about the Roosters, I do write about them a lot as well, because the Rooster sculptures that you see are very much the way the Rooster sculptures are positioned. And if you learn more, I don't have time to go into great detail, but as sort of the centuries of the golden exile, male, the masculine sort of figures, there was a rumor that was spread that police had actually put video cameras in their eyes. And that was one reason why the first batch of those roosters was vandalized. But it says a lot about this idea of surveillance. It's interesting you say watching you. But what's interesting as well, though, is the importance of the rooster in Lukumi, in La Regla de Ocha, in the Afro-Cuban religious traditions, which of course are practiced, by the way, by a lot of folks who are not of African descent. But you have the roosters hanging out in Cuban Memorial Park, and you smell death, and you see life, because these roosters, there's sacrifice of sacrifice of roosters, and those sacrifices are laid at the base of the ceiba. But at the same time, you see freely running around roosters and chickens and their chicks eating all the insects that come about from decomposing flesh. And I see this as very powerful, this idea of like the living and the death and the cycles of life and death, and the ceiba as this sort of portal for all of that. But it's interesting because those rooster sculptures might be very dominant. They're taken photos of. They have this sense of permanence, even though they're not permanent as the vandalism shows. But there's also the power of the living roosters that you mentioned.
Wonderful. Corina, I do have a question. I wonder about the inclusion of queer elements in the culture of Little Havana.
Yes.
So that has been changing in the last years. Can you please elaborate a little bit about that? And well, you also talk about the depictions and representations of historical characters and people from politics, but there is any representation known about famous Cuban queers and that kind of stuff?
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because actually in my, I was just quoted in an article about LGBTQ presence in Little Havana. So if you go to my LinkedIn profile, I just posted the link to that article. But yeah, actually, I'm really interested in that as well, because you also have this representation of, cisgender white masculinity sort of projection, right, going on around Little Havana in its earlier years. Actually, interestingly enough, the first brochure of the Latin Quarter for Little Havana had a Southern plantation on it and a Confederate flag and a little cotton ball. I'm just amazingly. But then you have, especially in 1980, you have such a strong presence of queer folk in Little Havana who, alongside more Afro-Cubans, and including Afro-Cubans, and that drove the folks of the Latin Quarter crazy, because that was exactly not what they wanted to project in their tourism plans for the Latin Quarter. And there was this exuberance, sense of sort of freedom in the spaces of Calle Ocho, where you had folks in drag walking around on Calle Ocho. There's stories about this. They write about it in the Miami Herald. There were, you see in later years, especially with the impact of Viernes Culturales, you see the growth, Viernes, the monthly arts festival that I mentioned. You see a capitalizing on the fact that you had from the Mariel and queer folks, an amazing sort of economy, arts economy in folks in theater, art galleries, Luis Molina being one of the very famous Molina Art Gallery. It's still around. A lot of those galleries unfortunately have closed that started. Also in just owning, running businesses, various kinds of businesses. But we had more theaters in Little Havana than any other neighborhood, Latinx neighborhood. Like we had about 12 different theaters, and a lot of those were owned by queer men. And you also had I Love Calle Ocho was owned by a lesbian couple. Right there on Calle Ocho, right in the district. And across the street, another gay-owned, it used to be a Guayabera shop. Now it's a little like nightclub. So there's, in the district in particular, many, LGBTQ friendly businesses. And it's interesting because it's a different dynamic than you have on like Miami Beach, for example. It's just, there's this a way of expression, but also sort of like I interviewed Luis Molina about this, and he said, you know, I'm not gonna hold hands walking down the street, but it's like everybody knows, but I'm not like super overt about it, but like everybody knows. And he has in his artwork a lot of sensual symbolism in the artwork that he sells in his gallery. But there is not, in terms of particular famous folks, I haven't seen sort of symbolism in murals or in public spaces or in that kind of way. However, you now have Gay 8 Festival. Are you aware of that?
Yeah.
So you have the Gay 8 Festival, which is the biggest Latinx gay festival in the United States, now happening where? In the Heritage District. So it's very interesting that there is, it's like if you're going to create a space and you're going to define it as this is the space of Cubanidad that is white, cisgender, male, we're going to, and now you have a lot of women running businesses, a lot of women getting involved in Viernes Culturales. And there was historically no acknowledgement about the work of women behind the scenes of these male-dominated institutions like the Kiwanis. All male, except more recently, they finally added a woman to their board. But other than that, it's always been all male. Who is the staff? All women, doing all the work behind that Cayocho Festival. So I'm just saying that there are these interesting dynamics and relationships going on.
Well, I think that with this image of queerness, we can in some way close this amazing webinar. I want to thank everybody. I really enjoyed these 3 days, and all of the speakers were amazing. I hope that we get the opportunity of meeting again. I am not sure, Jillian, if you want to say something before we go, but thank you all for being here with us.
Thank you. On behalf of Cyber, I really think that this program was so amazing. And I feel like there were lots of different topics that we don't hear about very often that need to be talked about, and people need to know about it. And I learned a lot myself. So, and thank you to everybody who attended. I feel like you all have been really wonderful in bringing along this conversation and sharing your experiences. And I hope that you've learned a lot as well. And yeah, thank you, Alberto. Thank you to Maida. I don't think Maida's here now. And to our speakers, you all are are wonderful. I was going to ask if is Viernes Culturales tonight?
Well, Joe Carroyo did his little thing against Viernes Culturales because he didn't like the more progressive chair of the board, Bill Fuller. He reserved every last Friday of the month for his own festival, even though for over a decade, Viernes Culturales had always been on the last. So talk about like displacing, you know, the opportunity, and then he starts using it. So now it's on the 3rd Friday of every month. And in terms of what's happening with COVID, I'm not sure, but it has moved to the 3rd Friday of every month since Carroyo took office. Can you believe that? But that's what I'm talking about.
Well, go ahead, Jillian.
Oh, I was just going to say, I've always heard about it, but I've never been. And I was thinking, oh, if it's tonight, maybe I'll go. But yeah, now I know I'll have to mark my calendar to find out.
Look at find their Facebook page. They have a Facebook page, and unless it's changed, viernesculturales.org is their website.
Nice.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Okay, so see you, everyone. Keep in touch, please.
Yeah, have a wonderful weekend.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.